This is the story of a nation torn apart, where brothers became enemies and ideals clashed on the blood-soaked fields of battle. Journey with us through the American Civil War, as we unravel the events that ignited this fierce conflict. From the simmering tensions of a divided nation to the thunderous roar of cannon fire at Gettysburg, we'll take you through every skirmish, battle, and pivotal decision. Meet the legendary generals who led their men with unwavering resolve, both Union and Confederate. Join us as we bring to life the stories of courage, sacrifice, and the relentless fight for a nation's soul. This is more than history, this is the essence of America's struggle for unity. Buckle up, because this journey through the American Civil War will captivate, inform, and leave you wanting more. Our story continues on March 5, 1861. It's the day after Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated President of the United States of America. Gideon Welles took the helm as U.S. Secretary of the Navy. With the sharp mind of Gustavus Vasa Fox by his side, they transformed the Navy from a scattered mess into a powerful force. From only 42 ships ready for service to a staggering 641 by war's end, the Union's naval might was unmatched. Meanwhile, in Missouri, the state convention made it clear they wouldn't follow Georgia into secession. They sent a protest to the president, standing firm with the Union. Down in South Carolina, Confederate Brigadier General Beauregard arrived in Charleston. He took command of the forces surrounding Fort Sumter, setting the stage for the conflict's first shots. And in Texas, Confederate authorities ordered all federal troops to evacuate. Their destination? The coast for transport back to New York to New. On March 6, 1861, the Confederate States of America took significant steps to establish its military forces. First, the Confederacy aimed to create a regular army termed the Army of the Confederate States of America, or ACSA. Although intended to be equivalent to the U.S. regular army, the ACSA never truly existed in a tangible form. They broadly adopted the rules and regulations of the U.S. Army, but with different nomenclature. The ACSA was authorized to appoint 4 brigadier generals and commissioned around 750 officers. However, most subsequent commissions were made in the Provisional Army of the Confederate States, or PACS. Officers who left the U.S. Army were offered commissions at their same grade in the Confederate Army, but were often promoted at least 1 grade higher. Meanwhile, the Provisional Confederate Congress called for volunteers to form the PACS, which would become the Confederacy's primary military force. An army of up to 100,000 men was authorized for 12 months' service, with brigades commanded by Confederate officers. Individual states raised regiments, which were then grouped into brigades within the PACS. On the same day, the Confederate Congress established the Confederate States Lighthouse Bureau. Its chief officer was to be a captain or commander of the Confederate States Navy. Raphael Semmes, a former U.S. Navy commander, was assigned to command this bureau, reporting for duty in early April. In Washington, D.C., President Abraham Lincoln refused to meet with 3 envoys sent by the Confederate government. Martin J. Crawford, John Forsyth, and A.B. Brown attempted and failed to arrange meetings with the new federal administration, seeking recognition as representatives of a sovereign nation. In Missouri, the state convention called for a meeting of southern states that hadn't yet seceded. They aimed to propose constitutional amendments ensuring equal rights for all states within the Union, and strongly opposed secession. In South Carolina, Confederate Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard moved to prevent supplies from reaching Fort Sumter, where food was dwindling. Beauregard increased training drills for the South Carolina militia, preparing them to operate the guns facing the fort. Finally, in Texas, Fort Brown was surrendered to Texas state authorities. This fort, originally Fort Texas, was significant in the Mexican-American War and had been renamed in honor of Major Jacob Brown. Confederate Colonel John Salmon Ford occupied the fort with a garrison until 1863, marking the beginning of the Confederacy's control over the area. On March 7, 1861, a flurry of significant events marked the Confederate States' actions. First up, Colonel Samuel Cooper resigned as Adjutant General of the U.S. Army. He soon joined the Confederacy, becoming both the Adjutant General and Inspector General of the Confederate Army. Initially a brigadier general, he was quickly promoted to general. Although the highest-ranking officer, his staff role meant he was outranked by all non-staff general officers with field commands. Colonel Lorenzo Thomas took his place in the U.S. Army. In Alabama, Braxton Bragg was appointed the 2nd Brigadier General in the Confederate Army. He commanded the Department of West Florida and forces in Pensacola, aiming to threaten the Union garrison at Fort Pickens. Meanwhile, in Georgia, the state convention reassembled, continuing its efforts to assert Georgia's stance in the unfolding conflict. In Louisiana, the state legislature secretly transferred $536,000 in bullion from the U.S. Mint and Customs to the Confederate States. Over in Texas, significant movements occurred. The U.S. Army abandoned Camp Verde, a post established in 1856. Secretary of War Jefferson Davis had initiated an experiment using camels for desert transport here. However, the Civil War interrupted this unique project, and the fort was evacuated in 1869. Union soldiers were held prisoner by Confederates at nearby Prison Canyon Ranch in 1861. Also in Texas, Camp Ringgold was evacuated by the U.S. Army and occupied by pro-Confederate forces. Established in 1848 on a river bluff for strategic observation into Mexico, Camp Ringgold had a tumultuous history. Named after Major Samuel Ringgold, it changed hands multiple times during the war. Union troops briefly seized it in 1863, but Confederates, led by Colonel John Salmon Ford and Colonel Santos Benavides, held it until the war's end. Post-war, it was renamed Fort Ringgold in 1865. Then, on March 12, 1861, the USS Powhatan sailed into New York Harbor, home at last from Veracruz, Mexico. This mighty warship had seen action across the Pacific, from China to Japan. Meanwhile, down in Texas, Major Caleb Chase Sibley led the U.S. forces in abandoning Fort McIntosh in Laredo. Established back in 1849 by the 1st U.S. Infantry, this fort was a guardian of the Texas frontier. Originally named Camp Crawford, it was soon renamed to honor Lieutenant Colonel James Simmons McIntosh, a hero of the Mexican-American War. With the onset of the Civil War, strategic shifts were afoot. Fort McIntosh, a key river crossing, was left silent, until Union troops marched back in come October 1865. On March 13, 1861, Alabama made headlines by ratifying the Confederate Constitution. This wasn't just a symbolic act, it handed over control of forts, arsenals, and other key facilities to the Confederate government. Meanwhile, in Missouri, things were heating up. The state was neutral, but Governor Claiborne Fox Jackson had a soft spot for the South. U.S. Captain Nathaniel Lyon wasn't having it. He suspected Jackson might try to seize the St. Louis arsenal if Missouri seceded. Lyon, with a little help from his abolitionist buddy Francis Preston Blair Jr., took command of the arsenal. He armed pro-Union wide-awakes under the cover of darkness and even smuggled extra weapons to Illinois. And get this, Lyon disguised himself as a farm woman to spy on the Missouri State Guard. He claimed to expose Governor Jackson's plot to seize the arsenal. These bold moves on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line were game-changers in the early days of the Civil War. On March 14, 1861, the Confederate Congress authorized a 5th Brigadier General for the Army of the Confederate States. Now, one of these officers was set to be both Adjutant General and Inspector General, making him quite the big cheese. They were all to be commissioned from March 16th based on their former U.S. Army ranks. But here's where it gets spicy. President Jefferson Davis's method for calculating seniority? Not everyone's cup of sweet tea. Some officers were downright miffed about how line and staff commissions were weighed. And don't forget Louisiana's patriotic donation of $536,000 on March 7th. The Confederate Congress accepted it with high praise for Louisiana's generosity. These decisions and funds shaped the early Confederate Army's hierarchy and morale, stirring both unity and discord. March 15, 1861, was an eventful day in the early stages of the American Civil War. President Abraham Lincoln found himself in a precarious situation. He sought advice from his cabinet on whether to reinforce the beleaguered garrison at Fort Sumter. All but one of his cabinet members, Montgomery Blair, advised against it. Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Portland Chase, and Secretary of State, William Henry Seward, were among those opposed. They insisted that if Fort Sumter was to be reinforced, Fort Pickens should be too. Interestingly, Seward went a step further, making unauthorized assurances to Governor Pickens of South Carolina that Fort Sumter would soon be surrendered. Meanwhile, Major General Winfield Scott, the General-in-Chief of the Army, provided a grim assessment. He estimated that 20,000 men would be required to relieve the fort, a force far beyond federal capacity at the time. On the naval side, a more cautious approach was suggested. A clandestine resupply mission without landing troops seemed feasible. In the Confederate States of America, Lieutenant Colonel Abraham Myers was appointed Quartermaster General of the Confederate Army. His official promotion to colonel would come later, on February 15, 1862. As president of the military board, Myers played a crucial role in designing the first Confederate Army uniform. It consisted of a blue flannel shirt, gray flannel pants, a red flannel undershirt, cotton drawers, wool socks, boots, and a cap. Despite his skills in accountancy, Myers faced significant challenges. Insufficient funds, the failure of the Confederate dollar, and poor railroad connections in the South hampered his efforts. He struggled to control the inefficiency and carelessness of his remote subordinates. On the same day, the Confederate Congress authorized the construction or purchase of 10 gunboats for the Confederate Navy. This move was part of their strategy to bolster naval capabilities and protect their waters. Down in Texas, Camp Wood was abandoned by the U.S. Army. Established on May 20, 1857, by Lieutenant J.B. Wood and a company of the 1st U.S. Cavalry. The camp was named after Brevet Major George W. F. Wood. He had succumbed to disease contracted in the Mexican War and the Second Seminole War. Located on the site of the old Spanish mission San Lorenzo de la Santa Cruz in Real County, the camp was strategically positioned to protect the San Antonio-El Paso Road and the Rio Grande Valley. After its abandonment, Camp Wood was intermittently occupied by Texas state troops and used by the Confederate Frontier Battalion under Colonel James Morris. On March 16, 1861, the winds of change swept across America, bringing a flurry of significant milestones in the Civil War era. First, in the United States Army, Colonel Edwin Vose Sumner of the 1st U.S. Cavalry was promoted to Brigadier General in the U.S. Regular Army. This promotion filled the vacancy left by the dismissal of David Emanuel Twiggs, who had departed to join the Confederacy. Sumner's new role also saw him nominated to command the Department of the Pacific, succeeding Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston of the 2nd U.S. Cavalry, who was also leaning toward the Confederacy. Meanwhile, in the Confederacy, 2 critical military elements were established by the Provisional Congress on the very same day. The regular Navy of the Confederate States, known as the NCSA, was officially formed. This fledgling Navy would play a crucial role in the maritime conflicts that were to come. Additionally, the Confederate States Marine Corps was created as a battalion-sized force consisting of 6 companies and a headquarters element, all under the command of a major of Marines. Over in the Arizona Territory, significant political movements were afoot. The Arizona Territory State Convention at Mesilla voted to leave the Union and sought accession to the Confederacy. This decision marked a significant shift in allegiances and set the stage for future conflicts in the region. Down in Georgia, the state took a monumental step by ratifying the Confederate Constitution. This act further solidified Georgia's commitment to the Confederacy and its cause. In Louisiana, however, the political landscape was a bit more complex. The state legislature voted down an ordinance that would have submitted the Confederate Constitution to a vote by the people of the state. This decision indicated a reluctance to fully embrace the new Confederate government without broader public support. Nevertheless, Major General of Mississippi Militia Earl Van Dorn was appointed colonel in the Confederate Army and assumed command of the forts protecting New Orleans, indicating a strong military presence in the region. Back in Missouri, political tensions were high. An amendment to the 5th resolution of the Majority Report of Missouri's Committee on U.S. Relations was voted down. This amendment would have asserted that Missouri would never support nor aid a seceding state in making war upon the United States government, nor provide men and money for the purpose of aiding the United States government to coerce a seceding state. The rejection of this amendment highlighted the divided loyalties within Missouri. In Texas, Governor Houston, not one to shy away, issued a proclamation to the people of the state, protesting against this unlawful action by the convention after he was removed from office. This moment underscored the intense political struggles and the fight for control within the state. Then, on March 17, 1861, the Confederate Navy Department dispatched 3 key figures: Commander Lawrence Rousseau, Commander Ebenezer Farrand, and Lieutenant Robert T. Chapman, to New Orleans. Their mission? Negotiate the construction of gunboats for the Mississippi River. These vessels were crucial for controlling the vital waterways. Meanwhile, in the wilds of Texas, Camp Hudson was abandoned by the U.S. Army. Established on June 7, 1857, Camp Hudson had safeguarded wagon traffic and stagecoaches on the San Antonio-El Paso Road. Named after Lieutenant Walter W. Hudson, who tragically died after a clash with hostile Indians in 1850, the camp stood as a sentinel on the west bank of the Devil's River. Located near Hudson Canyon and Huffstutler Springs, it was later occupied by the Confederate 2nd Texas Cavalry. They used it as a frontier outpost until 1862. March 18, 1861. In Little Rock, the Arkansas Convention faced a crucial decision. An ordinance of secession was proposed, but it was defeated by a narrow margin, 39 votes to 35. However, the debate didn't end there. The convention managed a compromise, agreeing to let the people decide on secession or cooperation with the Confederacy. This critical vote was set for the first Monday in August 1861. Now, down to Florida. Confederate Brigadier General Braxton Bragg issued a firm order. He banned the passage of supplies to the U.S. garrison at Fort Pickens and to the U.S. Navy squadron off Pensacola. Despite this, Union forces still held on to Fort Taylor at Key West and Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortugas. The Confederates, lacking the means to threaten these posts, were at a stalemate. On the same day, U.S. Lieutenant Adam Jacoby Slemmer, in command at Fort Pickens, made a controversial decision. He complied with existing laws and returned 4 fugitive slaves to their masters. A grim reminder of the complex and painful realities of the time. Moving over to Texas. Samuel Houston, a man of contradictions, was removed from his post as governor. Though a slaveholder, Houston opposed Texas secession from the Union. When Texas joined the Confederate States on March 2, 1861, Houston refused to recognize it as legal. The Texas legislature, however, upheld secession, leading to Houston's eviction from office. He was succeeded by Lieutenant Governor Edward Clark. To avoid bloodshed, Houston declined President Lincoln's offer of 50,000 U.S. troops to stop Texas's secession. Finally, in the Washington Territory, tensions flared on the Columbia River, near its confluence with the Kootenai River. Hostile encounters with indigenous peoples marked the day, underscoring the turbulent times. Each event on March 18, 1861, paints a vivid picture of the era's struggles and complexities. On March 19th, the Confederates took over a ton of forts in Texas. Camp Leona, established on March 13, 1849, by Captain Seth Eastman and 56 soldiers, later became Fort Inge, named after Lieutenant Zebulon M.P. Inc., who was killed in the Mexican War. Fort Inge was one of 8 forts created to establish federal authority along the Mexican frontier. These forts protected settlers, guarded the border, and ensured the safe passage of supply trains and mail along the San Antonio-El Paso military road. Next, Fort Clark, initially called Fort Riley, was established on June 20, 1852. Renamed a month later, it served to guard the Mexican border and the same military road. Colonel Joseph King Fenno Mansfield's 1853 inspection report highlighted its isolation, leading to the recommendation for more forts. Finally, Fort Lancaster, set up on August 20, 1855 by Captain Stephen D. Carpenter, also guarded the San Antonio-El Paso road. These forts, though now abandoned by the United States, once played crucial roles in securing Texas's frontier, and now would play a role in the Civil War in the country it was trying to defend. March 20, 1861. First, in Florida, the sloop Isabel, carrying supplies for the U.S. fleet, was seized off Pensacola by Florida state authorities. This bold move signaled Florida's commitment to the Confederate cause. In Georgia, the state passed an ordinance allowing the Confederate States government to occupy, use, and possess all military forts, navy yards, arsenals, and custom houses within its limits. This action strengthened the South's military infrastructure. Meanwhile, in Texas, U.S. Lieutenant Colonel Electus Backus ordered the abandonment of Fort Brown. Established in 1846 at present-day Brownsville, this fort had a storied past, including a siege during the Mexican War. Notable figures like Ulysses S. Grant and James Longstreet once served there. The fort's control shifted to the Confederates, who held it until 1863, when Union forces reclaimed it after a dramatic evacuation and fire. Further in Texas, Captain Ole Shepard abandoned Fort Duncan. Established in 1849 at Eagle Pass, This fort was crucial for scouting against Native Americans and trade crossing into Mexico. The Confederates renamed it Rio Grande Station, making it a vital port for exporting cotton. It was one of the last Confederate outposts to surrender in 1865. Lastly, the Texas state legislature confirmed the action of the Texas Convention in deposing Governor Samuel Houston. The legislature also transferred the forts, arsenals, and other military facilities in the state to the Confederate government. This solidified Texas's position within the Confederacy. Then, on March 21st in Alabama, Confederate officials seized the supply sloop, USS Isabella, at Mobile. It was on its way to Pensacola, a crucial supply point. This bold move sent shockwaves through the Union forces. Over in Louisiana, the state ratified the Confederate Constitution. Governor Moore didn't waste any time. He authorized the transfer of all seized arms and property to the Confederate government. Louisiana was now fully committed to the Southern cause. Meanwhile, in South Carolina, Gustavus Vasa Fox was on a secret mission. Aboard the steamer Baltic, he scouted Fort Sumter, looking for a way to relieve the besieged fort. Major Robert Anderson, commanding the garrison of 82 men, was running out of supplies. Time was ticking. Fox's reconnaissance would shape the fate of the fort and the start of the Civil War. Fox reported back to President Lincoln, recommending a daring sea operation. This mission would set Fox on the path to becoming Assistant Secretary of the Navy. March 22, 1861, was a game-changer for the Confederacy. David Emanuel Twiggs, once the third highest-ranking general in the U.S. Army, he switched sides and became Major General in the Confederate Army. He commanded the unofficial Department of Louisiana, outranking fellow defectors like Beauregard and Bragg. But their later promotions would soon eclipse his seniority. Meanwhile, in Kentucky, the State Rights Convention was in full swing. They denounced any government attempt to collect revenue, calling it coercion. They urged the border states to unite with the Confederacy if such attempts were made. They even proposed a convention of border states to solidify this stance. Out west in Nevada Territory, James W. Nye became governor. His appointment marked another twist in the unfolding drama of 1861. Let's wind the clock back to March 23, 1861, when California came close to seceding from the Union. On this day, the Monty Mounted Rifles, a pro-secessionist militia, were formed in El Monte, California, by A.J. King, the undersheriff of Los Angeles County, and some other influential folks. Their aim? To support Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston in stirring up pro-secessionist activities. But here's where things get spicy. Federal authorities caught wind of their plans when U.S. Army officers at San Pedro intercepted a shipment of arms sent by none other than California's Governor John G. Downey. This bold move effectively cut off the militia's access to weapons and put a halt to what could have been a full-blown insurrection. Imagine how different history might have been if those arms had slipped through. Now that's just part of the story. Over in Virginia, the USS Cumberland arrived at Hampton Roads from its station at Veracruz, New Mexico, on the very same day. This mighty warship would later play a significant role in the Union's naval efforts during the Civil War. Meanwhile, down in Texas, things were heating up. The state ratified the Confederate Constitution on March 23, 1861, solidifying its commitment to the Confederacy. That's not all. Fort Chadbourne, a key military outpost established in 1852 by Captain John Beardsley, was abandoned by the U.S. Army. This fort had a storied history, named for 2nd Lieutenant Theodore Lincoln Chadbourne, who fell in the Mexican War. It was designed to protect a crucial part of the trail to Santa Fe and the Butterfield Overland Mail route. Confederate Colonel Henry Eustace McCulloch took control of the fort, but it wouldn't see U.S. troops again until 1867, only to be abandoned once more in 1868. A few days later, on March 26, 1861, Alvin Saunders became governor of Nebraska Territory on this very day. His leadership played a crucial role in shaping the future state of Nebraska. Meanwhile, down in Charleston, South Carolina, the state convention was in full swing. These folks were making monumental decisions that would echo through the annals of history. And let's not forget Texas. Confederate Colonel Earl Van Dorn arrived with a mission to secure the conversion of U.S. garrisons to the Confederate cause. He was also tasked with organizing and arming pro-Confederate forces in the state. This was a bold move that set the stage for Texas's future in the Confederacy. March 27, 1861, was packed with pivotal moments. Let's start with the Dakota Territory. William Jayne took the reins as governor, setting the stage for a new chapter in the wild Midwest. Jayne's leadership would shape the future of this vast and untamed land. Now, down to the sunny shores of Florida. Santa Rosa Island was buzzing with activity as reconnaissance began, laying the groundwork for strategic military maneuvers. This was a crucial step in the unfolding drama of the Civil War. Louisiana was making waves, too. The Louisiana State Convention adjourned without setting a date to reconvene. Talk about leaving folks hanging. This move left many questions about the state's future role in the Confederacy. And finally, Missouri. The Missouri House passed a resolution declaring it unnecessary to call a national convention to propose amendments to the U.S. Constitution. This decision reflected the state's tense stance amid the brewing national conflict. In the heart of Texas, Fort Mason stood as a sentinel of history. Established in 1851, it was a bastion against Native American raids. But by March 29, 1861, its destiny would change forever. With the winds of war howling, President Lincoln's cabinet made a bold decision: stand firm and retain control of federal forts in the South. Plans were drawn to resupply, not evacuate. Fort Mason, abandoned by the U.S. Army, became a symbol of the Union's determination. Colonel Robert E. Lee, who would soon join the Confederacy, had his last command here. For a brief moment in 1862, the Confederates held 215 prisoners within its walls, mostly Union sympathizers. Yet, by December 24, 1866, the fort was back in Union hands. March 31, 1861. In Florida, the reconnaissance at Santa Rosa Island came to an end. The strategic importance of this location was undeniable, as it played a pivotal role in the early days of the Civil War. Union and Confederate forces eyed each other warily, knowing that control of this island could tilt the balance of power. Meanwhile, down in Louisiana, Lieutenant Lawrence Rousseau made waves. After 52 years of service in the United States Navy, he resigned and cast his lot with the South. His resignation was accepted by the U.S. Navy Department and became effective on February 11th. With his commission backdated, Rousseau became the highest-ranking officer in the Confederate States Navy until 1862. He took command of the Mississippi River Naval Squadron, fitting out commerce raiders and bolstering the defenses of New Orleans and the Mississippi River. Up in Virginia, U.S. Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles took decisive action. He ordered 250 men to be transferred from New York to reinforce the garrison at the Norfolk Navy Yard. This move was a clear signal of the escalating tensions and the Union's commitment to hold strategic points. Then in Texas, Fort Bliss was abandoned and surrendered to state forces. Originally established in 1848, Fort Bliss had seen its fair share of action. The Union garrison at Fort Bliss was directed to surrender to Confederate forces, and it remained under Confederate control until August 20, 1862, when Union Colonel James Henry Carleton forced out the garrison. The retreating Confederates destroyed Fort Bliss, sparing only the hospital housing their sick and wounded. The post wasn't reoccupied by Union forces until the war ended. America's Industrial Revolution had a secret weapon, the Morrill Tariff. Passed on April 2, 1861, the Morrill Tariff jacked up import taxes. Drafted by Representative Justin Smith Morrill, this move was a game-changer for industrialists and workers alike. With Southern senators out, the tariff sailed through Congress. It boosted domestic industry, raised wages, and covered deficits. This laid the groundwork for America's industrial powerhouse era. Now to Charleston Harbor on April 3, 1861. The 180-ton schooner Rhoda H. Shannon, fresh from Boston, aimed for Savannah but ended up in hostile waters. Bad weather clouded their route, and the master mistook Charleston Harbor for Tybee Island. Waving the American flag for a pilot, none came, so they ventured in. Suddenly, Confederate guns on Morris Island roared, shots landing dangerously close. The Shannon's master raised the U.S. flag, but the cannons kept barking. Realizing their peril, the schooner turned and anchored just inside the Charleston bar. U.S. Major Robert Anderson from Fort Sumter sent an officer to get answers. Lieutenant Colonel W.G. de Saussure defended Confederate orders, no U.S. flags allowed. Both sides breathed easy when the misunderstanding was cleared. No harm done. The Shannon, weather-beaten but undamaged, headed back to sea. Rumors of a resupply for Fort Sumter were swiftly dismissed. Just another day in the volatile lead-up to war. On this fateful day in 1861, the winds of change blew fiercely in the United States. President Abraham Lincoln, acting on the advice of Gustavus Vasa Fox, ordered a relief expedition to resupply and reinforce Fort Sumter. Major Robert Anderson was commanded to hold out till relief arrived and not to surrender the fort. The Virginia State Convention, meanwhile, voted against a secession referendum by 89 votes to 45 April 4, 1861, a day of decisions that echoed through the ages. It's time for a quick trip back to April 5, 1861. On this day, U.S. President Abraham Lincoln ordered a naval expedition to relieve Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The warships USS Powhatan, USS Pawnee, and USS Pocahontas, along with the U.S. revenue cutter Harriet Lane, were ready to reprovision the fort. Leading the squadron was Captain Samuel Mercer, and aboard the steamer Baltic, nearly 200 soldiers awaited their mission. Meanwhile, in Texas, Fort Quitman saw a different fate. The garrison, reduced to just Lieutenant Zenas Bliss and 20 men, surrendered to Texas authorities. Established in 1858 to protect the San Antonio to El Paso road, Fort Quitman was named for General John A. Quitman. When Texas joined the Confederacy, Bliss and his men were captured instead of evacuated. Deep in the night, a secret mission was underway. April 6, 1861. The USS Pawnee slipped through the waters, carrying 300 sailors, secretly gathered in Charleston. Their mission? To strengthen Fort Pickens in Florida. Lieutenant David Dixon Porter, ordered to join from New York, added to the intrigue. This action aimed to secure a crucial stronghold as tensions with the Confederates grew. A hidden move in the grand chess game of the Civil War. Step into April 7, 1861. Lieutenant John Lorimer Worden departed Washington by rail with secret orders for Captain Henry A. Adams of the USS Sabine. Sent by none other than President Lincoln, these orders were to reinforce Fort Pickens. With soldiers and sailors en route from New York aboard the USS Pawnee and USS Powhatan, time was of the essence. The fate of the Union hung in the balance. April 8, 1861. South Carolina makes a significant move, transferring forts and other military property to the Confederate government. President Abraham Lincoln sends a message to Governor Francis W. Pickens. Lincoln says, "An attempt will be made to supply Fort Sumter with provisions only. If such attempt be not resisted, no effort to throw in men, arms, or ammunition will be made without further notice." This puts the ball squarely in the Confederates' court. Back down or be forced into firing the first shot. Meanwhile, the U.S. revenue cutter Harriet Lane, under Captain John Faunce, departs New York. Its mission? Join the Fort Sumter relief expedition. But there's a twist. Secretary of State William Henry Seward's confusion leads to a mix-up. The USS Powhatan, meant to escort the Fort Sumter expedition, is instead sent to the Gulf of Mexico. There it supports Seward's secret mission to resupply forts like Fort Taylor and Fort Jefferson. Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles had already ordered the Powhatan for the Fort Sumter mission. But Seward had different plans. He got President Lincoln's permission for the Powhatan to escort his Gulf expedition. But by then, it was too late. The Powhatan was already in the Gulf before the conflict of interests was realized. Thus, Fort Sumter was left without its much-needed naval support. This mix-up, known as the Seward-Meigs-Porter affair, highlighted the need for better clarity in command and authority across government departments. On the same day, William H. Wallace is appointed governor of Washington Territory, but he never serves. April 9, 1861. In the heart of the District of Columbia, U.S. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Ferguson Smith of the 10th U.S. Infantry was appointed to command the newly formed Department of Washington. Arriving on April 10th, Smith's appointment marked a pivotal move, providing clear leadership in the face of looming conflict. This new territorial command was the first of its kind, a direct response to the imminent threat to the nation's capital. Over on the Virginia side of the Potomac River, Colonel Charles W. Sanford of the 7th New York Militia took on command of the modest field forces gathering there, ready to defend. Meanwhile, up in New York, the U.S. Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Gustavus Vasa Fox, embarked on a special mission. He sailed from New York aboard the chartered steamer Baltic, tasked with observing the relief expedition at Fort Sumter for President Abraham Lincoln. Accompanying the Baltic were the warships USS Pawnee and USS Powhatan, along with the U.S. revenue cutter Harriet Lane. This fleet represented the federal government's resolve to support and resupply Fort Sumter, a symbol of Union presence in the rebellious South. Farther south, in Montgomery, Alabama, the Confederate cabinet convened with a grave decision to make. They resolved to open fire on Fort Sumter, aiming to force its surrender before any federal relief could arrive. Not everyone agreed. Secretary of State Robert Augustus Toombs stood alone in opposition. Yet, the decision was made. Secretary of War Leroy Pope Walker sent word to Brigadier General Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard, instructing him to demand the fort's evacuation if resupply was certain, and to bombard it if refused. April 10, 1861. In Washington, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Ferguson Smith mobilized militia and volunteer forces to defend the capital. His efforts were crucial in ensuring that Washington, D.C. was ready for whatever lay ahead. Meanwhile, South Carolina was a hive of activity. The U.S. revenue cutter Harriet Lane arrived off Charleston before midnight. She was part of President Lincoln's expedition to resupply Fort Sumter. The USS Powhatan had already left New York, carrying troops aboard the steamer Baltic. USS Pawnee was just leaving Hampton Roads, Virginia, to join the mission. The Harriet Lane had departed New York on April 8th and reached Charleston on April 11th. That evening, she fired on the civilian steamship Nashville, mistaking it for an enemy vessel. When Nashville showed the United States ensign, the firing ceased. Lieutenant W.D. Thompson, USN, is credited with firing the first naval shot of the Civil War during this encounter. Down in Fort Sumter, South Carolina, tensions were rising. Confederate Brigadier General Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard, leading the forces at Charleston, demanded the evacuation of Fort Sumter. U.S. Major Robert Anderson replied that he would evacuate by noon on April 15th unless attacked or resupplied. Beauregard, empowered by the Confederate government, announced he would open fire on the fort at 4:20 a.m. on April 12, 1861. In Virginia, the USS Pawnee, commanded by Stephen Clegg Rowan, departed Hampton Roads to join the relief mission bound for Fort Sumter. At the Norfolk Navy Yard, Captain Charles S. Macaulay was ordered to prepare the USS Merrimack for a potential move to a northern yard. The stage was now set for the first shots of the Civil War. April 11, 1861. In the District of Columbia, the Confederate Peace Commission departed Washington, leaving the capital in a tense state. Their mission to seek a peaceful resolution had failed, and with their departure, any remaining hope of avoiding conflict seemed to vanish. Meanwhile, in New York, the steamship Coatzacoalcos docked, bringing Union troops expelled from Texas garrisons. These soldiers, ousted by the Confederacy, marked a growing divide within the nation. Their arrival in New York underscored the escalating tensions and the reality that the Union was now preparing for war. Down in South Carolina, Brigadier General Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard demanded the surrender of Fort Sumter. Representing the Confederate government, Beauregard sent 3 aides, Colonel James Chestnut, Jr., Captain Stephen Dill Lee, and Lieutenant A.R. Chisholm, to deliver an ultimatum to Major Robert Anderson, the Union garrison commander. Anderson, aware that his supplies were dwindling and that he could only endure a few more days without reinforcements, refused the demand, hoping for a miracle. However, Beauregard had the authority from the Confederate Secretary of War Leroy Pope Walker to commence firing if the fort didn't surrender immediately. The 3 aides left Fort Sumter for Fort Johnson around 3 a.m. on April 12th, carrying back the message of defiance. Colonel Chestnut reported to Beauregard that the Union would not comply, setting the stage for imminent conflict. In Virginia, Commander James Alden of the U.S. Navy was ordered to take command of the USS Merrimack, which was undergoing repairs at the Norfolk Navy Yard. Chief Engineer Benjamin Isherwood was dispatched to ensure the ship's engines were in working order for its evacuation to a northern port. The Merrimack's preparation signaled the Union's strategic maneuvers to safeguard its assets in the face of impending hostilities. April 11, 1861, was a day filled with critical decisions and actions, each pushing the nation closer to the brink of war. And with the refusal to surrender Fort Sumter, the first shots of the Civil War were just hours away. Now the day of April 12, 1861 has arrived. A newly divided nation stands on the brink of a war unlike any it has ever seen. The United States Navy, once a symbol of national pride, finds itself ill-prepared for the conflict ahead. Decades of relative peace and a focus on overseas deployments left the Navy with a meager force at home. A mere 42 ships comprised its entire roster, many scattered across the globe or in desperate need of repair. Adding to the Union's woes was the exodus of experienced officers. Men who had devoted their lives to the Navy grappled with divided loyalties. Many, hailing from southern states, felt the pull of their home states more strongly than the call of the Union. Names like Matthew Perry and Franklin Buchanan, heroes of a bygone era, cast their lots with the Confederacy. Their defection dealt a significant blow to the Union's naval expertise and leadership. The task of rebuilding and revitalizing the Navy fell upon the shoulders of President Abraham Lincoln and his newly appointed Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles. At the helm of the Union's naval resurgence stood Gideon Welles, a man of quiet determination. Welles, sometimes referred to as Father Neptune for his long white beard, may have lacked naval experience, but he possessed a keen intellect and a talent for administration. Assisting Welles was his assistant secretary, Gustavus Vasa Fox. Fox, a veteran naval officer, brought to the table the practical experience that Welles lacked. Together, they formed a formidable partnership, their combined talents proving instrumental in transforming the Union Navy into a powerful fighting force. They embarked on a massive shipbuilding program, commissioning new warships and converting merchant vessels for military use. Recognizing the need for skilled sailors, they expanded recruitment efforts, offering bonuses and appealing to patriotic fervor. Shipyards across the north hummed with activity as the sounds of hammers striking iron and saws biting through timber filled the air. By the war's end, the fleet had swelled to an impressive 641 ships, a testament to their administrative skill and the industrial might of the North. The outbreak of war demanded a fundamental shift in the Union Navy's operations. Peacetime duties, such as exploration and diplomacy, were put on hold as the Navy's focus narrowed to a single, overriding objective: defeating the Confederacy. This shift required a complete overhaul of the Navy's deployment strategy, concentrating its limited resources where they would have the greatest impact. One of the most significant changes was the implementation of the blockade. Recognizing the Confederacy's dependence on foreign trade, the Union Navy sought to strangle its economy by closing its ports to shipping. This ambitious plan, stretching over 3,500 miles of coastline, presented a daunting challenge for a Navy still in the midst of expansion. Union warships, both new and converted, patrolled key ports, intercepting blockade runners attempting to evade their watch. The blockade, while not always successful in stopping every ship, had a devastating impact on the Confederate economy. The Navy's ability to transport troops and supplies along the Confederacy's extensive river system proved invaluable to the Union's war effort. While the bulk of the Union Navy's attention focused on the Atlantic coast and the inland rivers, the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean was not forgotten. The Pacific Squadron, though small in number, played a vital role in protecting Union interests on the West Coast and projecting American power across the Pacific. Tasked with patrolling a vast area stretching from South America to the Arctic, the Pacific Squadron faced unique challenges. Despite these challenges, the squadron successfully protected American commerce and prevented the Confederacy from establishing a foothold in the Pacific. On land, the Union Army worked to fortify key ports along the Pacific coast. The Pacific Squadron's vigilance and the fortifications erected along the coast served as a deterrent, ensuring that the Union's western flank remained secure throughout the war. The first shots of the Civil War erupted not in some sprawling battlefield, but in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. Fort Sumter, a masonry fortress guarding the harbor entrance, became a symbol of the Union's resolve in the face of secession. Its bombardment by Confederate forces on April 12, 1861, marked the beginning of the bloodiest conflict in American history. Fort Pickens, located on Santa Rosa Island near Pensacola, Florida, held similar strategic importance. Unlike Sumter, Pickens remained in Union hands, serving as a thorn in the side of the Confederacy throughout the war. Its guns controlled the entrance to Pensacola Bay, home to a significant Confederate naval yard. The reinforcement of Fort Pickens in the early days of the war was a crucial victory for the Union. It denied the Confederacy a key naval base and provided a strategic foothold for future operations along the Gulf Coast. The successful defense of Pickens, along with the capture of other Confederate forts and coastal positions, highlighted the Union Navy's growing strength and its importance in achieving victory. The Union Navy's transformation during the Civil War stands as a testament to the nation's industrial might and the determination of its people to preserve the Union. Let's dive right into the heart of the action, at Fort Sumter. This pentagonal fortress sitting in the middle of the main ship channel was a marvel of its time. Built on an artificial island, it was designed to withstand naval assaults with its 40-foot-high walls that were 8 to 12 feet thick. But come April 1861, things were different. Union Major Robert Anderson commanded the garrison, which was far from full strength. Just 9 officers, 68 soldiers, 8 musicians, and 43 workmen, when it should have been 650 men, strong for wartime. The Confederates were itching for a fight. Negotiations to surrender the fort went nowhere. At 3:20 a.m., they warned Major Anderson that a bombardment was imminent, and sure enough, by 4:30 a.m., the first shot of the Civil War was fired. Captain George S. James fired the signal gun from Fort Johnson on James Island, and then the Confederate batteries opened up. Now, Edmund Ruffin might have claimed he fired the first aggressive shot at Stevens Point, but it was Lieutenant Henry Farley who got the first hostile round off from James Island. That shot landed smack dab in the deserted parade ground of Fort Sumter. Union Captain Abner Doubleday retaliated around 7:30 a.m., but they were at a disadvantage. Their guns were short on ammo and lacked explosive shells. Sergeant John Carmody did his best, stepping outside to fire some of the exposed guns, but it was risky business. The safest option was to use the guns in the lower-level casemates, but those couldn't effectively threaten the Confederate positions at Fort Moultrie. Fort Sumter was built to fend off naval attacks, but the land-based Confederate guns easily lobbed shots over its walls. By afternoon, the Union soldiers were running low on ammunition, and only 6 guns were firing intermittently. With supplies dwindling and the Confederates relentless, the fort's guns fell silent overnight. At 1 p.m., a glimmer of hope arrived in the form of the steamship Baltic, USS Pawnee, and USS Harriet Lane. Major Anderson's men thought they were saved, but the ships couldn't enter the harbor under fire and had to retreat. Fort Sumter's garrison was left to fend for themselves. Now let's go back to Alabama on April 13, 1861, where a daring mission unfolded. Lieutenant John Lorimer Worden of the U.S. Navy was on a secret mission. His task? Deliver critical orders to Captain Henry A. Adams, the commander of the USS Sabine. The orders were clear: reinforce and hold Fort Pickens in Pensacola Bay, Florida. Worden completed his mission, but his journey took a dark turn when he was apprehended near Montgomery and thrown into prison. Talk about a twist of fate. Meanwhile, back in Pensacola Bay, the USS Sabine, under Captain Adams' command, began blockading the harbor. Thanks to the reinforcements and supplies that arrived on April 12th, the Union established the Department of Florida, headquartered at Fort Pickens. This strategic location became the launching pad for naval and military operations in the Gulf of Mexico. Major Harvey Brown, soon promoted to colonel, took command of this new department. Now let's shift our focus back to Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Confederate bombardment was relentless. Shells were raining down, and a serious fire broke out in the officers' quarters, threatening the main magazine. Confederate gunners, spotting the flames, intensified their assault with hotshot projectiles. By noon, several fires raged within the fort. Union gunners trapped in the casemates were in grave danger. Over 34 hours, the fort was hammered by around 4,000 artillery and mortar rounds. The flagstaff was shot away, adding to the chaos. Finally, at 2:30 p.m., Major Robert Anderson surrendered Fort Sumter to former Senator Louis Trezevant Wigfall. The Union soldiers evacuated the next day, marking a decisive Confederate victory. And over in Texas, Fort Davis faced its own trials. This strategic fort was crucial for protecting immigrants, mail coaches, and freight wagons on critical routes like the San Antonio-El Paso Road and the Chihuahua Trail. But under orders from Brigadier General David Emanuel Twiggs, the U.S. Army abandoned Fort Davis. It wasn't long before 20 Confederate soldiers occupied the fort, securing a key position for their cause. These events showcase the intensity and complexity of the Civil War, with each location playing a vital role in the broader conflict. After surrendering Fort Sumter, the Union garrison was allowed to leave with honor. During the 50-gun salute to the flag, tragedy struck. A spark ignited a pile of cartridges, killing Private Daniel Howe instantly and mortally wounding Private Edward Galloway. The salute was stopped at 50 shots. Galloway was taken to a Charleston hospital where he later died. These were the first fatalities of the Civil War, marking a somber beginning to the bloodiest conflict in American history. On April 15, 1861, the nation awoke to the stark reality of civil war. The news spread like wildfire, shaking the very foundations of the country. President Abraham Lincoln, faced with this unprecedented crisis, acted decisively. He knew that the fate of the Union hung in the balance and that his actions would shape the course of history. He issued a call for Congress to convene in a special session. This move was crucial, as it sought to unify the government in response to the secessionist threat. The nation anxiously awaited the outcome. Citizens from all walks of life held their breath, wondering what the future would hold. Lincoln's next move was even more significant. He understood that decisive action was needed to preserve the Union. He issued a proclamation calling for 75,000 militiamen from the Union states. This bold call to arms was a rallying cry for those who believed in the Union's cause. The nation held its breath as states grappled with this call to action. The political landscape was fraught with tension and uncertainty. Would they heed the call and take up arms against their countrymen? The question loomed large in the minds of many. The response to Lincoln's proclamation was swift and dramatic. Across towns and cities, the call to defend the Union resonated deeply. Across the North, citizens rallied to the Union cause. Patriotic fervor swept through communities, uniting people in a common purpose. Men enlisted in droves, eager to defend the nation's unity. The sight of young men in Union uniforms became a common and stirring image. However, the proclamation also had the effect of pushing more states towards secession. The divide between North and South grew ever wider. While the eyes of the nation were fixed on the major battles and events unfolding in the East, the conflict quickly spread to the western frontier, bringing the war to new and unexpected territories. In California, a state deeply divided in its loyalties, tensions ran high as communities found themselves at odds. Two minor but significant incidents on April 15th highlighted the volatile situation and the fragile peace. Near the town of Auburn, a group of secessionists clashed with pro-Union citizens at a place called Mad River, a name that would soon be etched in local memory. Details of the skirmish are scarce, but it underscored the deep divisions within the state, divisions that mirrored the national conflict. The fact that citizens were willing to take up arms against each other, even in this remote corner of the country, illustrated the intensity and reach of the conflict. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, a plot to seize the federal arsenal at Benicia was foiled, preventing a significant escalation. The plot, orchestrated by Confederate sympathizers, aimed to funnel weapons to the South, which would have bolstered their efforts significantly. The plan was thwarted thanks to the vigilance and quick action of pro-Union forces, preventing a potentially disastrous outcome for the Union. These incidents, though small in scale, revealed the precarious balance of power in California and the ever-present threat of internal conflict. Meanwhile, Confederate forces, emboldened by their recent victory at Fort Sumter, demanded the surrender of Fort Pickens. The Confederates were eager to capitalize on their momentum and secure another significant stronghold. The fort was one of the few remaining Union strongholds in the South, making it a prime target for Confederate forces. Its capture would have been a significant blow to Union morale and a strategic advantage for the Confederacy. Union Lieutenant Adam J. Slemmer, commanding a small garrison inside Fort Pickens, refused to surrender. Despite being outnumbered and under immense pressure, Slemmer and his men stood firm. Slemmer's defiance was a testament to the Union's determination to hold on to the fort. His leadership and the resolve of his troops were crucial in maintaining Union control over this strategic position. The Confederates, unwilling to risk a direct assault on the well-defended position, opted to lay siege to the fort. They hoped to starve out the Union garrison and force a surrender through attrition. The standoff at Fort Pickens highlighted the strategic importance of coastal fortifications. These forts were not just military installations, but vital points of control for both sides. Control of these forts meant control of vital shipping lanes and access to crucial ports. The ability to move supplies and reinforcements by sea was a significant advantage in the war effort. The Confederacy, eager to control its own coastline and deny the Union any strategic advantage, was determined to wrest control of Fort Pickens from Union hands. Their strategy meetings were filled with plans to isolate and capture the fort. The siege of Fort Pickens would continue for months, a tense stalemate in the Gulf of Mexico. Both sides were locked in a battle of wills, with neither willing to concede. On April 16, 1861, a series of events unfolded that would shape the course of the American Civil War. President Abraham Lincoln, determined to cripple the Confederate economy, forbade trade between the loyal states and the seceded states. This move aimed to cut off vital supplies to the South and weaken their resolve. It was a bold step in what was quickly becoming a brutal conflict. Meanwhile, the Confederate government issued a call for 32,000 volunteers to defend their territory against the Union's alleged invasion. The South was rallying its forces, preparing for a long and bloody struggle to preserve their way of life. In the Indian Territory, Fort Washita in the Chickasaw Nation was abandoned by the U.S. Army. Established back in 1842 by Captain George A.H. Blake of the 2nd U.S. Dragoons, Fort Washita had a storied past. It was an open-plan fort with a central parade ground, surrounded by post buildings. On this very day, April 16, 1861, Confederate troops took over the fort, holding it until 1865. The fort would later be destroyed by a mysterious fire on August 1, 1865, never to be reoccupied by U.S. forces. Down in North Carolina, Fort Caswell was reoccupied by Confederate forces. This fort, named after the first governor of North Carolina, Richard Caswell, had a unique design, a masonry third system fort with an irregular pentagon shape. It had been seized initially on January 10, 1861, and then returned to the U.S. Army until hostilities resumed. The Confederates fortified it even more, turning it into a stronghold with a massive earthwork and heavy artillery. Fort Caswell would remain in Confederate hands until January 17, 1865, when its garrison abandoned and blew it up. In Virginia, Captain Garrett J. Pendergrast, commanding the USS Cumberland at Norfolk, received orders that would change his course. Instead of heading to Veracruz, Mexico, he was directed to assist in moving U.S. Navy vessels from the vulnerable Gosport Navy Yard to safer locations. This move was crucial in ensuring that the Union's naval power remained intact during the escalating tensions. On April 17, 1861, in the Confederate States of America, President Jefferson Davis extended an invitation to ship owners and masters to apply for letters of marque and reprisal, essentially calling for privateers to take up arms on the high seas. This bold move aimed to disrupt Union shipping and boost the Confederacy's naval capabilities. Down in Florida, the USS Powhatan arrived off Pensacola under the command of Lieutenant David Dixon Porter. This ship played a crucial role in protecting the landing of 600 troops from the steamer Atlantic at Fort Pickens. The reinforcement of this fort ensured that the Confederates were denied access to the best harbor on the Gulf of Mexico. Meanwhile, in Maryland, ardent secessionists gathered to discuss how to secure the state's adherence to the Confederacy. This meeting highlighted the deep divisions within the state and the lengths to which some were willing to go to join the Southern cause. Up in Massachusetts, the Union 6th Massachusetts Infantry moved to Baltimore with 11 companies of infantry. Colonel Edward Jones, aware of the potential for trouble, ordered his troops not to fire unless fired upon. This decision was crucial in maintaining discipline and avoiding unnecessary conflict with the city's population. In Missouri, Governor Claiborne Fox Jackson refused to comply with the federal government's demand for its quota of militia. This defiance was a clear indication of the state's divided loyalties and foreshadowed the fierce internal conflict that would unfold in Missouri. Pennsylvania saw a significant milestone on this day, with Nicholas Biddle of Pottsville joining the Washington Artillery Company. He became the first African American to volunteer for the Union Army. marking a pivotal moment in the struggle for equal rights and representation. An incident also occurred in Palmyra, Missouri, further adding to the day's tension. Details are scarce, but it underscores the widespread unrest and conflict simmering across the state. In Tennessee, the governor, like his counterpart in Missouri, refused to comply with the federal government's demand for its quota of militia. This refusal demonstrated the state's resistance to Union control and its leanings towards the Confederacy. Virginia was at the heart of the day's events. The Virginia State Convention passed an ordinance of secession in a secret session by 88 votes to 55. The decision to secede was driven by the Union's call to arms issued on April 15, 1861. Virginia's secession brought significant military power to the Confederacy and placed pro-Confederate forces dangerously close to the Union capital. Lastly, in Norfolk, Virginia, Confederates installed obstacles in the channel to prevent the sailing of U.S. Navy vessels. However, the passage of the USS Pawnee and USS Cumberland revealed these efforts to be ineffective. Now, with all of this activity happening all over the country, there was so much confusion and uncertainty that nobody knew which way to turn or what would happen next, but what was yet to come, nobody could have ever expected.